I'm Millie, 32 female. I live in a small but comfortable condo that I own, a little sanctuary of order and calm that feels a world away from the noise of the city. By day, I'm a forensic accountant, a job that suits my personality perfectly. I find stories in numbers and truth in spreadsheets. The story that changed my life, however, wasn't hidden in a client's ledger. It was buried in my own family's finances, and it started with a single, brutal comment at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The air in my mother's house was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and simmering resentment. Thanksgiving had always been a tense affair since my mother, Margaret, married Charles 10 years ago. It wasn't that Charles was a bad man, he was just a man who came with baggage, the most oversized piece of which was his son, Jacob. This year, the tension was palpable. The stock market had been volatile, and Charles, a retired banker, seemed to carry the weight of every dip in the Dow Jones Industrial Average in the slump of his shoulders. Margaret, ever the gracious host and art gallery curator, floated through the dining room, her smile as carefully arranged as the expensive centerpieces on the table. I was helping her bring out the gravy when my stepbrother, Jacob, made his grand entrance. At 35, Jacob still lived his life as if he were a 20-something trust fund kid, which in essence he was. He called himself a lifestyle influencer, a title that seemed to involve little more than posting pictures of expensive meals and borrowed cars to a modest online following. He sauntered in, dressed in designer clothes that screamed new money, a painfully bright smile plastered on his face. "Sorry I'm late," he announced to the room, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "Had to close a major brand deal. The hustle never stops." Charles beamed with a father's misguided pride, while my mother offered a polite but strained greeting. I just gave a slight nod and went back to my task. My relationship with Jacob was, at best, a ceasefire. We orbited each other at family gatherings, two celestial bodies held in place by the gravitational pull of our parents, but we never truly connected. I found his arrogance grating, and he clearly saw me as a boring 9-to-5 drone. Dinner began as it always did, with stilted small talk. Charles lamented the state of the economy, Margaret discussed her latest art acquisition, and Jacob bragged about his online engagements. I remained mostly silent, offering noncommittal hums and nods, focusing on the simple pleasure of my mother's cooking. The conversation eventually turned to the holidays. "Millie, dear," Margaret said, her voice bright, "are you still planning on staying with us through New Year's? Your old room is always ready for you." Before I could answer, Jacob scoffed loudly, putting down his fork with a clatter. "Seriously, she's staying here for 6 weeks? Don't you have your own place?" I stiffened. "I do, Jacob. I was just planning on spending more time with Mom and Charles this year." He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Right, so you'll just be living here rent-free for a month and a half. Must be nice." Charles shifted uncomfortably. "Jacob, that's enough." But Jacob was on a roll. He waved a dismissive hand. "No, Dad, it's a valid point. Some of us have to actually work for a living, you know? We can't all just be a burden." The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Burden. It landed like a physical blow. I looked across the table, expecting my mother to leap to my defense to put Jacob in his place. Instead, she just looked down at her plate, her lips pressed into a thin line. Charles cleared his throat and mumbled something about Jacob's tone, but there was no force behind it. In their silence, they became complicit. My face burned with a mixture of anger and humiliation. A burden. I, who had put myself through college and grad school without a cent of their help. I, who worked a demanding job and managed my finances with meticulous care. I, who had never asked them for anything, was a burden for wanting to spend the holidays in the house I grew up in. Jacob seemed to relish my shock. "What? It's true, I'm trying to build an empire here, and all this family stuff is a distraction. People need to pull their own weight." He said this with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never once had to worry about where his next meal was coming from. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the polished hardwood floor. The sound was unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "You know what, Jacob?" I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You're right. It's time I stopped being a distraction." I stood up, my napkin falling from my lap. I looked at my mother, her eyes pleading with me not to make a scene. I looked at Charles, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance. Then I looked back at Jacob, whose smug grin was starting to falter, perhaps sensing he had pushed too far. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice devoid of warmth. "I have some work to attend to. It seems I need to focus on pulling my own weight." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the dining room. I could hear my mother calling my name, a faint, distressed sound, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my coat and purse from the hall closet and walked out the front door, the cold November air a welcome shock to my system. As I drove back to my condo, the city lights ablur through my tear-filled eyes, Jacob's word echoed in my mind. Burden. He had meant it to wound me, to assert his own twisted sense of superiority. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. He thought he was putting me in my place, but all he had done was give me a purpose. My grief and humiliation began to cool, hardening into a cold, clear resolve. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days sifting through financial records, finding the rot hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. Jacob, with his flashy lifestyle and vague, business deals, lived a life that was one big, glittering fabrication. And his father, Charles, had always been secretive about his finances, even with my mother. A sudden, chilling thought occurred to me. A man like Jacob doesn't exist in a vacuum. He had to be funded from somewhere. By the time I reached my apartment, the tears were gone. I walked over to my desk and powered on my computer, the glow of the screen illuminating my determined face. He wanted me to pull my own weight? Fine, I would. And while I was at it, I would find out just how much weight he and his father were really carrying. The game was on. Jacob had called me a burden. He was about to find out that this burden was the last person he ever should have provoked. The days following Thanksgiving were a blur of quiet fury. I threw myself into my work, the familiar comfort of numbers and spreadsheets a balm to my wounded pride. I didn't answer my mother's frantic calls or Charles's apologetic texts. The silence was my shield, a space where I could let my anger simmer and my plan begin to take shape. My first call wasn't to a lawyer or a therapist. It was to my best friend, Susan. Susan and I had been friends since college, where we'd bonded over late-night study sessions and a shared sense of ambition. While I went into the world of finance, she'd taken a more adventurous path, eventually becoming a highly skilled private investigator. She was sharp, discreet, and fiercely loyal. When I told her what had happened, her response was immediate and exactly what I needed to hear. "That absolute parasite," she said, her voice laced with venom. "Okay, Millie, we're not getting mad, we're getting everything. What's the plan?" I took a deep breath. "I have a theory, Suze. Jacob's lifestyle, it doesn't add up. He doesn't have a real job. This influencer thing is a joke. The money has to be coming from Charles, and Charles has always been cagey about his finances." "Cagey how?" Susan asked, her professional instincts kicking in. "He retired early from the bank under circumstances that were never fully explained," I recalled. "He manages all of their assets. My mom, Margaret, is the beneficiary of a significant trust from her grandparents, but she's never had to touch it because Charles's investments are supposedly so lucrative. She's completely in the dark. She signs whatever he puts in front of her." A heavy silence fell between us. "Oh, Millie," Susan said softly, "you think he's been using your mom's money to fund Jacob's life?" "I think that's the tip of the iceberg," I replied, my voice hardening. "I think Charles's entire financial empire might be built on a foundation of lies, and I think Jacob knows. His arrogance, his sense of entitlement, it's not just personality. It's the confidence of someone who thinks they're untouchable." Susan was quiet for a moment, processing. "All right," she said finally. "This is what we're going to do. You're the numbers genius. You need to get access to their financials. Bank statements, tax returns, investment portfolios, anything you can get your hands on. I'll handle the other side. I'll do a deep dive on Jacob and Charles. Public records, social media, background checks. We'll see what skeletons are hiding in their closets. The first step was the hardest. I had to talk to my mother. I finally answered one of her calls a week after the disastrous dinner. Her voice was a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Millie, thank God, I've been so worried. What Jacob said was unforgivable. Charles and I are so sorry." "I appreciate that, Mom," I said, keeping my tone even. "But I need to ask you for some Ething, and I need you to trust me, even if it sounds strange." I could hear the confusion in her voice. "Anything, honey, what is it?" "I need you to get me copies of your and Charles's financial statements for the past 5 years," I said. "Bank accounts, investment records, tax filings, everything." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Why on earth would you need that, Millie?" This was the delicate part. I couldn't reveal my suspicions without solid proof. It would only cause her to shut down and defend her husband. I had to frame it in a way she would understand. "Mom, after what happened, I started thinking," I began, choosing my words carefully. "I want to make sure my own finances are in order for the long term. I want to understand how a successful portfolio like yours and Charles's is managed. It's purely for my own education. Consider it a professional exercise." It was a weak excuse, but it was the best I had. Margaret was hesitant. "I don't know, dear. Charles is very private about those things. He handles everything." "That's the problem, Mom," I said, a bit more forcefully than I intended. "You should have an understanding of your own financial situation. What if something were to happen to him? You need to be prepared. Just tell him I'm helping you get organized. Frame it as a daughter helping her mother." My argument seemed to resonate with a flicker of insecurity she'd never admitted to. She finally agreed, albeit reluctantly. A few days later, a large manila envelope arrived at my office via courier. It was filled with documents, just as I'd asked. As I laid them out on my conference table, my heart pounded. This was it, the point of no return. That night, with a pot of strong coffee brewing, I began to dig. For hours, I sifted through pages of numbers, my trained eyes scanning for inconsistencies, for red flags. At first, everything looked pristine. Charles was meticulous. The investment accounts showed steady, if unspectacular, growth. The tax returns were filed perfectly, but then I found it. It was a small, recurring wire transfer, listed under a vague memo. Property management fee. It was a substantial amount, sent monthly to a holding company I didn't recognize, LCR Enterprises, LLC. It wasn't the amount that caught my eye, but the destination. Why would a retired banker be paying a property management fee for a home they owned outright? I did a quick corporate search. LCR Enterprises, LLC was registered in Delaware, a state known for its corporate secrecy. The registered agent was a generic service, offering no clue as to the true owner, but the name LCR, it tickled at the back of my mind. Leo Charles Richard? No, that wasn't it. Then it hit me. I pulled up Jacob's social media profile. His full name was Jacob Charles Richards. His initials, JCR, but LCR, it was close. Maybe a typo. Or maybe something else. I cross-referenced the dates of the wire transfers with Jacob's online activity. A pattern quickly emerged. A large transfer would go to LCR Enterprises, and within days, Jacob would post about a new luxury purchase. A designer watch, a trip to Monaco, a down payment on a flashy sports car. The correlation was too strong to be a coincidence. My blood ran cold. This was more than just a father spoiling his son. This was a systematic siphoning of funds disguised as a legitimate business expense. And it was coming from a joint account he held with my mother. He was using her money, likely from her inheritance, to fund Jacob's extravagant life, all while calling me a burden. The anger that had been simmering for weeks boiled over into a white-hot rage. This wasn't just about an insult at the dinner table anymore. This was a deep, calculated betrayal of my mother's trust. Charles had built a secret pipeline from my mother's wealth directly into Jacob's pocket, and he had hidden it in plain sight. I called Susan immediately, my voice trembling with fury. "I've got it," I said. "It's a shell company, LCR Enterprises. I'm almost certain Charles is using it to funnel money to Jacob." Susan was all business. "Good work, Millie. I found something on my end, too. Something you need to see. It's about the house, your mother's house." "What about it?" I asked, a sense of dread creeping into my voice. "The deed," Susan said grimly. "I pulled the property records. Your mother's name isn't the only one on it. Charles added Jacob to the deed as a joint tenant with right of survivorship 5 years ago. Margaret's signature is on the filing." I sank into my chair, the phone feeling heavy in my hand. He hadn't just been stealing her money. He was trying to steal her home. The home she had inherited from her parents, the home I grew up in. If my mother passed away, the house would bypass her will, bypass me entirely, and go straight to Jacob. Charles had been slowly and systematically stripping my mother of her assets, ensuring his son would inherit everything, leaving me with nothing. The secret was out, and it was far more cruel and calculated than I could have ever imagined. My mother was being financially bled dry by the 2 men who were supposed to protect her, and as I sat there in the dark, the damning documents spread before me, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to dismantle their entire world. The revelation about the house deed changed everything. This was no longer just about financial misconduct. It was a profound, personal betrayal that struck at the heart of our family. My mother's home, the repository of my childhood memories, was now a pawn in Charles's and Jacob's long con. My mission became crystal clear. I had to untangle this web of deceit, not just to protect my mother's future, but to reclaim our past. My first task was to understand the full scope of LCR Enterprises. The Delaware registration was a deliberate roadblock designed to obscure ownership. But Charles had made a critical mistake. While he had hidden the ownership, he couldn't hide the transactions. The wire transfers from my mother's joint account were the breadcrumbs, and I was determined to follow them to their source. I spent the next week buried in financial forensics. Using my professional software and access to proprietary databases, I started tracing the flow of money from LCR Enterprises. It was like peeling back the layers of an onion. The shell company didn't just receive money, it moved it. Funds were funneled through a series of smaller accounts, each one opened under a different variation of the LCR name, a classic money laundering technique designed to confuse and deter auditors. It was slow, painstaking work. I cross-referenced bank records with public filings, credit card statements with social media posts. A picture began to emerge of an operation far more sophisticated than I had anticipated. LCR Enterprises wasn't just a slush fund for Jacob's toys, it was a central hub for a network of questionable financial activities. While I was deep in the digital trenches, Susan was hitting the pavement. She was a master of old-school investigation, a skill set that perfectly complemented my own. She started by looking into Charles's past, specifically his early retirement from the bank. "There were rumors," she told me over a secure line a few days later. "Nothing official, of course. The bank would never admit it. But the gossip among his former colleagues is that he was forced out. He was a loan officer, and he was caught fast-tracking and approving a series of high-risk commercial loans to developers who, let's just say, had questionable credentials. In return, he received substantial consulting fees paid to an offshore account." My fingers flew across the keyboard as she spoke. "Offshore, where?" "Cayman Islands," she said. "The trail went cold there, as it always does, but the timing is interesting. This was right before he met your mother. It's likely he used that seed money to set himself up as a legitimate, wealthy retiree." It all clicked into place. Charles wasn't just a cheat, he was a seasoned grifter. He had a history of manipulating financial systems for personal gain. He had simply moved on from defrauding a bank to defrauding his own wife. The next piece of the puzzle came from Jacob's side. Susan had been digging into his influencer career and found that his brand deals were almost entirely fictitious. The companies he claimed to partner with were either defunct or had no record of ever working with him. "He's creating the illusion of success," Susan explained. "He uses the money from Charles to buy the clothes, rent the cars, and stay at the fancy hotels. Then he fakes the brand sponsorships to create a legitimate-looking income stream. It's a house of cards, Millie, but it's a carefully constructed one." The real breakthrough, however, came from an unexpected source. While analyzing the LCR bank statements, I noticed a series of smaller, but regular, payments to a property management firm based in Florida. This was different from the property management fee Memo Charles used for the transfers to LCR. This was an actual payment from LCR. The firm was called Sunshine Realty Group. On a hunch, I asked Susan to investigate. See if Charles or Jacob own any property in Florida under their own names or any known aliases. 2 days later, she called me, her voice buzzing with excitement. "You're not going to believe this. They don't own property in Florida. Sunshine Realty Group manages a portfolio of vacation rentals. But guess who the primary investor in Sunshine Realty Group is? A holding company called Richards Holdings, Inc." "Richard is Charles's middle name," I whispered, my mind racing. "Exactly," Susan confirmed. "And Richards Holdings, Inc. is owned by a trust, and the sole beneficiary of that trust, Jacob Charles Richards. Charles didn't just give Jacob an allowance. He bought him an entire property management company. That's where the money is being laundered. The income from the vacation rentals is presented as legitimate business earnings for Jacob." I leaned back in my chair, stunned by the audacity of it all. They had created a complete, self-sustaining ecosystem of fraud. Charles would take money from my mother's accounts, funnel it through LCR Enterprises, and use it to fund a business that then provided Jacob with a clean, seemingly legitimate income. It was brilliant in its corruption. But their cleverness was also their downfall. They had created a paper trail. A long, complicated one, but a trail nonetheless. And I had it all. The wire transfers, the shell corporations, the fraudulent business, the deed to the house. I had a complete financial map of their deception. The final piece of information Susan uncovered was the most damning. The signature on the deed transfer, the one that added Jacob as a joint tenant on my mother's house, had been notarized. Susan managed to track down the notary public, a man who ran a small mail services shop in a different part of the state. "He was nervous," Susan reported. "At first, he claimed he didn't remember the transaction, but I have my ways. I showed him a picture of your mother and a picture of Jacob. He admitted that only Charles and Jacob were present when the document was signed and notarized. Your mother was never there." My breath hitched. He forged her signature." "He forged her signature," Susan confirmed. "And he got a notary to illegally verify it. Millie, this goes beyond just civil fraud. This is a criminal offense. Forgery, wire fraud, potentially even elder financial abuse. You've got them. You've got them cold." I looked at the mountain of evidence I had compiled. Spreadsheets, bank records, property deeds, corporate filings. It was a story of greed and betrayal, told in the cold, hard language of numbers. The money trail had led me right to the heart of their rotten empire. Now, it was time to plan how I was going to burn it to the ground. With the evidence in hand, the next phase of my plan began, transforming raw data into an airtight case. It wasn't enough to know what Charles and Jacob had done. I had to present it in a way that was irrefutable, leaving them no room to lie or escape. This meant diving deeper into the labyrinthine structure of their shell corporations. My focus narrowed onto the intricate web of transactions that moved money between LCR Enterprises, Richards Holdings, Inc., and a half-dozen other smaller, interconnected LLCs I had discovered. Each one had been set up with a specific purpose, like a series of locks in a canal, raising and lowering the water level to move a ship along. Here, the ships were my mother's money, and the destination was Jacob's pocket. I spent my days in a state of intense concentration, often working late into the night, fueled by coffee and a burning sense of purpose. I created flowcharts that mapped out every single dollar, from the moment it left Margaret's joint account to its final destination. The charts were a dizzying array of arrows and boxes, a visual representation of their greed. I could see the precise moments when large sums were disguised as investment capital, consulting fees, or loan repayments between the various entities. One of the most brazen schemes I uncovered involved a company called C&J Fine Arts, which I found registered to a P.O. box. This company would periodically sell non-existent pieces of art to my mother's gallery. Charles, using his influence and her trust, would approve the acquisitions. The gallery would then pay C&J Fine Arts, and the money would disappear into the LCR ecosystem. He wasn't just stealing from her personal accounts. He was using her professional life, her passion, as another vehicle for his fraud. This discovery felt like a particularly vicious twist of the knife. As I worked, I kept Susan updated on my progress. She, in turn, was working on the legal and logistical angles. Once you have the full picture, we need to decide on the best course of action, she advised. We could go to the authorities, file a civil suit, or both. A criminal case would be stronger with the forgery, but a civil suit would be faster in terms of freezing their assets. We decided on a two-pronged approach. The evidence of forgery and wire fraud was strong enough for a criminal complaint. But before we went to the police, we needed to make sure they couldn't hide the assets. We needed to prepare a civil lawsuit, complete with a request for an emergency injunction to freeze every known account associated with them and their companies. This required meticulous preparation. I began compiling a comprehensive report detailing every fraudulent transaction, every forged document, every lie. I wrote it in the dispassionate, factual language of a forensic accountant, but beneath the surface of every sentence was the cold fury of a betrayed daughter. The report grew to over 100 pages, complete with exhibits, timelines, and financial summaries. It was my weapon, and I was sharpening it to a razor's edge. During this time, I had to maintain a facade of normalcy. I started responding to my mother's texts with brief, non-committal answers. I told her I was busy with a major project at work and would be in touch after the holidays. It was a difficult balancing act, feigning civility while I was systematically dismantling her husband's life. Every polite text I sent felt like a betrayal in its own way, but I knew that revealing the truth to her prematurely would be catastrophic. She would confront Charles, he would deny everything, and they would have time to cover their tracks. I had to wait until the trap was fully set. One evening, while tracing a payment from Richards Holdings, Inc., I stumbled upon something that made my blood run even colder. It was a payment to a real estate lawyer in our city. Curious, I asked Susan to look into him. He specializes in high-asset divorce, she reported back the next day. And he's known for being ruthless. He helps wealthy spouses hide assets before a separation. The implication was horrifying. Charles wasn't just stealing from my mother, he was preparing to leave her. He was likely planning to drain her accounts, secure all the assets in Jacob's name, and then file for divorce, leaving her with nothing. The Thanksgiving insult, I realized, might have been part of a calculated plan to alienate me from my mother, to isolate her before he made his final move. He wanted to make sure that when he dropped the axe, she would have no one to turn to. This discovery erased any lingering doubts I might have had about the path I was on. This was no longer just about justice, it was about rescue. My mother was in imminent danger of losing everything, and she didn't even know it. The final piece of the puzzle was the house itself. The forged deed was the cornerstone of their plan. With Jacob as a joint tenant, the house was protected from being considered a marital asset in a divorce. It was already his, but they had made one more mistake. The house was owned free and clear, but to finance a recent renovation, Charles had taken out a home equity line of credit, HELOC. The bank that issued the HELOC would have done its own due diligence. They would have a copy of every document related to the property's ownership. I contacted the bank, pretending to be my mother's financial assistant, and requested a copy of the HELOC file for her records. It took a few days and some careful social engineering, but eventually, a digital copy of the entire file landed in my inbox. And there it was, a high-resolution scan of the fraudulent deed transfer, complete with the forged signature and the illegitimate notary stamp. It was the pristine, official copy I needed, a document that would be impossible for them to dismiss as a fake. I added it to my report, the final, damning piece of evidence. The maze was fully mapped. Every secret passage, every hidden chamber was exposed. I had followed the money, and it had led me through a world of deception more intricate and cruel than I could have imagined. Now, with the map complete, I was ready to lead the authorities through it, right to their front door. With the evidence gathered and the financial maze fully mapped, the next step was to transition from investigation to action. This required a level of strategic patience that tested my limits. Every fiber of my being wanted to confront them, to see the looks on their faces when they realized they'd been caught. But Susan's calm, professional guidance prevailed. A premature move could jeopardize everything. We had to build our case in the shadows and choose the perfect moment to strike. Our first move was to retain a lie. Susan introduced me to a man named Marcus Thorne, a former prosecutor who had a reputation for being a shark in civil litigation, especially in complex financial fraud cases. He was exactly who we needed. We met in his downtown office, the walls lined with law books and framed legal victories. I laid out my 100-page report on his vast mahogany desk. For nearly 2 hours, I walked him through my findings, from the first suspicious wire transfer to the forged signature on the deed. He listened intently, his expression unreadable, occasionally asking a sharp, probing question. Susan was there, providing context and corroborating the details of her own investigation. When I finished, Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a pen on a legal pad. He was silent for a full minute, his eyes scanning the key documents I had highlighted. Finally, he looked up, and a slow, grim smile spread across his face. "Ms. Peterson," he said, his voice a low rumble, "in my 25 years of practicing law, I have rarely seen such a meticulously constructed, privately compiled case. This isn't just a smoking gun, you've brought me the entire arsenal." His validation was like a balm on my frayed nerves. "So, what's our next move?" I asked. "We proceed on 2 parallel tracks, just as you and Ms. Vance planned," he explained. "First, the civil side. My team will draft a complaint and an ex parte motion for a temporary restraining order. This will allow us to freeze every single asset, bank accounts, investment portfolios, properties, the works, without tipping them off. We'll file it under seal. They won't know what hit them until the accounts are already frozen." He pointed to the copy of the forged deed. "Second, the criminal side. This document is our key. Forgery of a real property instrument is a serious felony. Combined with the evidence of wire fraud and potential elder financial abuse, the district attorney's office will be very interested in this. We won't go to the local police precinct. We'll go directly to the head of the Economic Crimes Unit. We'll hand them a prosecutor-ready case on a silver platter." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus's office became my second home. We worked tirelessly with his team of paralegals and junior associates to refine the legal filings. Every claim had to be backed by a specific piece of evidence from my report. We prepared affidavits, organized exhibits, and drafted the precise language of the injunction we would seek. Meanwhile, Susan was my eyes and ears on the outside. She kept a discreet watch on Charles and Jacob. Her reports were chilling. Charles had met with the divorce attorney twice more. Jacob had just leased a new, even more expensive sports car and was openly bragging on social media about a massive new business venture that was about to launch. They were accelerating their plans. The clock was ticking. One of the most difficult parts of this process was the emotional toll. I was living a double life. By day, I was a key player in a high-stakes legal battle, preparing to detonate a bomb in the middle of my family. By night, I was just Millie, a daughter grappling with an immense sense of betrayal and loss. I had moments of doubt, wondering if there was another way, a less destructive path. But then I would picture my mother, trusting, and oblivious, and my resolve would harden like steel. Charles and Jacob weren't just stealing her money, they were stealing her security, her dignity, and her future. I was the only one who could stop them. During this time, my mother's calls became more insistent. She was worried, not just about my absence, but about Charles's behavior. "He's been so distant lately, Millie," she confessed in a hushed tone over the phone one evening. "He's always on his computer, in hushed conversations. He told me he's restructuring some investments, but he gets angry if I ask questions. And Jacob, he's more arrogant than ever. It's like they share some secret I'm not privy to." My heart ached for her. "Just hang in there, Mom," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't show her. "Everything is going to be clear very soon, I promise." The final step was coordinating with the district attorney's office. Marcus, using his professional connections, secured a meeting with the head of the Economic Crimes Unit, a formidable woman named Ada Ramirez. We presented our case to her, and just as Marcus had predicted, she saw the strength of it immediately. "The evidence of forgery is compelling," she stated, her eyes sharp and focused. "And the financial structuring is indicative of a sophisticated laundering scheme. We'll open an investigation, but we'll do it quietly. We don't want them to get spooked and start destroying evidence." We devised a timeline. Marcus would file the civil suit and the motion to freeze assets on the morning of December 24th, Christmas Eve. He chose this date strategically. The courts would be slow, and the banks would have skeleton crews. The order would be executed before they even knew what was happening. As soon as the asset freeze was confirmed, Ada Ramirez's team would be ready to move in. The plan was in place. The silent case was built. The legal machinery was primed and ready. All the pieces were set on the chessboard. As I left Marcus's office on the 23rd of December, a sense of calm washed over me. The storm was coming, and I was the one who was about to unleash it. Christmas Eve morning broke cold and gray, the sky a blanket of slate that matched the heavy feeling in my chest. This was the day. The culmination of weeks of sleepless nights, painstaking work, and repressed fury. At precisely 9:00 a.m., I was sitting in Marcus Thorne's office with Susan. Marcus was on the phone with the court clerk, his voice calm and authoritative. "Yes, the motion is filed under seal, case number 74B21. The judge has signed the order. It's being transmitted to the financial institutions now." He hung up the phone and looked at me. "It's done. The freeze is in effect. Every account we listed is now locked down. They won't be able to move a single cent." A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. The first part of the trap had been sprung. The next call was to Ada Ramirez. "The civil order is executed," Marcus informed her. "Your turn." Now, all we had to do was wait. The plan was for law enforcement, along with a civil process server, to serve the papers at my mother's house. The civil papers would include the lawsuit and a notice of eviction. Because the house was now part of a criminal investigation and a civil dispute over fraudulent transfer, and because Jacob was a co-owner under fraudulent pretenses, Marcus had successfully argued that the property needed to be secured, pending the outcome of the case. They were being legally removed from the scene of the crime. I had arranged for my mother to be out of the house. I'd called her the day before, my voice bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. "Mom, I have a surprise for you. I've booked us a spa day for tomorrow morning. My Christmas gift to you, a car will pick you up at 10. She had been thrilled, her voice lifting for the first time in weeks. It was a necessary deception, one that pained me deeply, but I couldn't bear the thought of her being there when it all went down. At around 11:30 a.m., Susan's phone buzzed. It was her contact, a retired police officer who was keeping an eye on the house from a discreet distance. "They're there," Susan said, putting the phone on speaker. 2 unmarked cars and a process server just pulled up. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pictured the scene, Charles and Jacob, probably still in their pajamas, sipping coffee, smugly anticipating a quiet Christmas Eve. Their world was about to be shattered. According to Susan's contact, the detectives and the process server approached the door together. Charles answered, his expression of mild annoyance quickly turning to confusion, then to panic, as he was presented with the thick stack of legal documents. The warrant, the lawsuit, the asset freeze, the eviction notice. Jacob appeared behind him, his usual smirk evaporating as he read the words on the papers. The detective's presence made it clear this was not a simple civil matter. They were there to secure the property and any potential evidence. They were informed that the house was now a frozen asset in a fraud investigation, and that they had 2 hours to vacate the premises with only their personal belongings. The eruption was immediate and predictable. Jacob started shouting, calling it a mistake, a ridiculous prank. Charles, the more seasoned con artist, turned pale and started demanding to speak to his lawyer. But there was nothing his lawyer could do. The judge's order was ironclad. Back in Marcus's office, we listened to the second-hand account, my hands clenched into fists. I could almost hear Jacob's entitled rage, Charles's desperate blustering. For so long, they had been in control, manipulating everyone and everything around them. Now, faced with the cold, unyielding power of the law, they were powerless. The process server, as part of his duty, had to inform them who had filed the civil suit. My name. The moment my name was read aloud must have been a shockwave. The burden, the quiet, overlooked stepdaughter, was the architect of their ruin. At 1:30 p.m. TW. Hours after they were served, 2 figures emerged from the house, carrying duffel bags. Jacob was red-faced, screaming into his phone. Charles looked like a ghost, his face ashen, his movements slow and stunned. They got into Jacob's leased sports car, a car that would likely be repossessed by the end of the week, and sped away. The house was sealed, the locks were changed. The first, most visible part of their empire had fallen. Phase 2 of the Christmas Eve plan was already in motion. The car I had sent for my mother took her not to a spa, but to the Four Seasons Hotel, where I had booked her a suite. I met her there, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. She was confused when I walked in. "Millie, what's going on? I thought we were going to the spa." I took a deep breath and sat down opposite her. I took her hands in mine. "Mom," I began, my voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk. Something has happened. Something you need to know about Charles and Jacob." For the next hour, I laid it all out for her. I didn't give her the dense, 100-page report, but a simplified, 10-page summary I had prepared, complete with copies of the most critical documents. The wire transfers from her account to LCR Enterprises, the flow chart showing the money laundering, and the forged deed to her home. She listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. She stared at the forged signature, her own name written in a crude imitation of her handwriting. She traced it with her finger, a single tear rolling down her cheek. When I finished, she looked at me, her eyes filled with a pain so deep it took my breath away. "All this time," she whispered, her voice cracking. "All these years, he was stealing from me, he was trying to take my home." The betrayal was a physical thing in the room, a heavy, suffocating presence. I held her as she wept, not just for the money or the house, but for the life she thought she had, for the man she thought she loved. It was a necessary cruelty, a painful surgery to remove a cancer she didn't know was killing her. That Christmas Eve was not one of celebration, but of quiet contemplation in a sterile hotel suite. But as my mother finally cried herself to sleep, I looked out at the city lights and I didn't feel triumph. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The house was secure. My mother was safe. The silent case I had built had finally roared to life, and its echoes were just beginning to be felt. The final act was yet to come. The 6 weeks between Christmas and the first week of February were a maelstrom of legal proceedings. Charles and Jacob, stripped of their access to illicit funds, were in a state of freefall. Their high-powered lawyers, once on retainer, quickly dropped them when the payments stopped. They were forced to hire a public defender who was completely out of his depth against the combined forces of Marcus Thorne and the district attorney's office. The asset freeze was devastatingly effective. Not only were their bank accounts locked, but the court order extended to all known assets. Jacob's leased car was repossessed. The Florida Property Management Company was placed into receivership, its income revealed to be a sham. The designer clothes, the luxury watches, the entire facade of their success, it all crumbled to dust because none of it had ever been truly theirs. My mother, Margaret, went through a painful but profound transformation. The initial shock and grief gave way to a quiet, simmering anger. The woman who had been content to let her husband handle everything was replaced by a woman who demanded to understand every detail of the case. She sat in on every meeting with Marcus, her questions sharp and insightful. It was as if the betrayal had awakened a part of her that had been dormant for years. She filed for divorce, her signature on the petition firm and decisive. The criminal case against Charles and Jacob was moving swiftly. Faced with irrefutable evidence of forgery, wire fraud, and money laundering, their public defender advised them to take a plea deal. Charles, in a desperate attempt to save his son, tried to take the full blame. But the paper trail I had created led directly to Jacob as a willing and active participant. He wasn't just a beneficiary, he was a co-conspirator. The plea deal was harsh. Charles pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts and was facing a significant prison sentence. Jacob, due to his more limited role, received a lighter sentence, 5 years of probation, a hefty fine that he had no way of paying, and 1,500 hours of community service. The most significant part of the civil settlement was that the fraudulent deed transfer was voided. My mother's home was hers again, solely and unequivocally. Charles was forced to relinquish any and all claims to her assets, including her trust and her gallery. The day of the sentencing was the last time I saw them in person. Charles' look. Ed like a broken man, aged a decade in a matter of weeks. Jacob was a shadow of his former self. His designer suit was gone, replaced by ill-fitting clothes. The arrogant smirk was replaced by a look of sullen resentment. He refused to make eye contact with me or my mother. There were no apologies, no remorse. There was only the bitter taste of defeat. Life began to find a new normal. My mother, with a strength I had never seen before, took control of her life. She hired her own financial advisor and, with my help, learned to manage her own portfolio. She threw herself into her work at the gallery, her passion reignited. The house, once a source of pain and betrayal, was slowly becoming a home again. We decided to host a New Year, New Beginning party in early February. It was a small gathering, just close friends. Susan was there, of course, and I raised a glass to her. "To my partner in crime," I said, and we both laughed. It was during that party that it happened. There was a knock on the door. When I opened it, I was shocked to see Jacob standing on the porch. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was wearing a thin jacket that was no match for the winter cold. "Millie," he croaked, his voice hoarse, I need to talk to you." I stood there, blocking the doorway, my arms crossed. "There's nothing to talk about, Jacob." "Please," he begged, and the sound was so pathetic, so devoid of his former arrogance, that it was almost unrecognizable. "I have nowhere to go. My friends won't talk to me. I have no money. I can't find a job. I need help." I looked at this man, this shell of a man, begging on the porch of the house he had tried to steal. The irony was so thick I could taste it. 6 weeks ago, on Thanksgiving, in this very house, he had called me a burden. He had mocked me for wanting to spend time with my family, for not pulling my own weight. Now, he was homeless, penniless, and stripped of everything, begging for a handout from the very person he had scorned. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of the party, the sounds of laughter and friendship. I had my life, my career, my friends, my family. He had nothing. The revenge was complete, more so than I could have ever planned. It wasn't just legal or financial, it was poetic. "I seem to recall you giving me some advice a while back, Jacob," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as the winter wind. "You told me that people need to pull their own weight, that the hustle never stops. So, my advice to you is to start hustling. His face crumpled. He opened his mouth to say something else, but at that moment, a police car cruised slowly down the street. It was probably just a routine patrol, but its presence was a stark reminder of the new reality. He was a felon on probation. He shouldn't be here. He glanced at the car, then back at me, his eyes wide with fear. The officer behind the wheel looked in our direction. Without another word, Jacob turned and scurried away into the darkness, a pathetic figure disappearing down the street. I closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. I didn't feel a rush of triumph or a surge of pity. I just felt quiet. The long, exhausting battle was finally, truly over. I walked back into the living room, where my mother was holding a glass of champagne, a genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in a long time. She caught my eye and raised her glass in a silent toast. The slate was clean, the future was unwritten. And for the first time in years, our house was filled not with resentment and secrets, but with hope.